vice eminent scholars, esteemed academicians from around the globe, friends, well-wishers, and family of Professor Jacob John Kattakayam. Thank you for joining us today, and we are excited to have you all here and look forward to a productive and enlightening session. We, the students of Professor Kattakayam and the Institute of Social Research and Action, ISRA, proudly welcome you to the fourth memorial lecture instituted in honor of Professor Jacob John Kattakayam. Professor Kattakayam, an inspiring teacher, a compassionate guide, ardent administrator, the list is almost unending. But beyond any quality that can be associated with his name, he was a great human being who found goodness in everyone whom he met and associated with. He believed in his inner strength that made him a humanist in principle. We are sure anybody who has associated with him would vouch for this. He made sure that his students flourished in their merits and accomplished as academics, administrators, welfareists, and the discipline in Kerala at large grew in length and breadth. This humble effort is the least we as his students and accomplices could do to live up to his spirits and continue whatever he has begun. Here is a brief description about the organizing team. The JJK Students Collective is a band of 41 students for whom he was the research supervisor. They are currently researchers, administrators, welfareists, and academicians around the country and abroad. Institute for Social Research and Action is an NGO based in Thiruvananthapuram, Kerala, has been an initiative by Professor Kattakayam with the idea of engaging in research, training, and advocacy on any issues that requires an expert management. On behalf of the organizing team, let me welcome each one of you to the Professor J.J. Kattakayam 4th Memorial Lecture. The first 3 editions of the lectures were delivered by Professor Arjun Appadurai, Goddard Professor in Media, Culture and Communication from New York University, Professor Michael Buravo, University of California, Berkeley, and Professor Margaret Abraham, Hofstra University, New York. Today's lecture, titled Decolonizing Transnational Feminist Analytic, promises to be a profound exploration of critical themes in gender and globalization. We are honored to have Professor Surinder Jodhka, Professor of Sociology from JNU, for chairing the session, and Dr. Manisha Desai as our distinguished speaker. With the mentoring of the peers of Johnson and Professors Anthony Palakil and Professor Lakshmi V. Nair, and with the support of my fellow researchers in different committees, this event has been meticulously organized by Dr. Sandhya R.S., convener, and Dr. Jaykumar M.S. as co-convener. Let me now invite Dr. Sandhya R.S., Professor and Head, Department of Sociology, University of Kerala, to formally welcome the dignitaries and delegates.
Thank you, Shinju. Good evening, all. To teach is to touch a life forever. Touch a life in what ways? With ideas that change perspectives, with the habits that change ways of being, with the bonds that change one's relation to communities, a teacher's influence transforms a student's life. Today, in this 4th memorial lecture, in honor of Professor Kattakayam sir, we celebrate the inspiration and ripples this great teacher has sparked in the lives of his students and colleagues and towards the subject. It is with great pleasure that we welcome you all to the 4th lecture series in honor of Professor Jacob John Kattakayam, organized by the Students Collective and the Institute of Social Research and Action. Professor Kattakayam, a distinguished academician and educator, has made monumental contributions to the field of sociology and beyond. Professor Kattakayam's prolific career as an academician and educator is truly remarkable. At the University of Kerala, he served in various capacities, including Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences and Director of Academic Staff College, ultimately 2008. His tenure as president of the Indian Sociological Society 2009 to 2011 was exceptional with the publication of the 7-volume book series Studies in Indian Sociology by Sage Publications. He was also a visiting faculty member at numerous foreign universities, chaired the Committee for Aging in the International Sociological Association, and represented this committee at the United Nations on issues concerning the elderly. In summary, Professor Kattakayam was a teacher first and foremost, as well as a seasoned academician, educationist, research guide, administrator, leader, and organizer par excellence. Most importantly, he was an enabling friend to many building scholars across the state and country. We are immensely honored to welcome Professor Surinder S. Jodhkar, a distinguished sociologist from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, as our esteemed chair. Professor Jodhkar's groundbreaking research on social inequalities, caste dynamics, agrarian change, and rural India has profoundly shaped the field. His recent publications, The Indian Village, Rural Lives in the 21st Century, and the Oxford Handbook of Caste showcases his unwavering commitment to understanding and addressing social issues. As a recipient of the ICSSR Amartya Sen Award and the 2024 Malcolm Adisheshaya Award, Professor Jodhkar's contribution to sociology and development studies are widely acclaimed. It is our great privilege to have a person who was also a close friend of Dr. Jacob John Kattakayam to chair this session. JJK Students Collective and ISRA very warmly welcome you, sir, to this program. Over the past 3 years, this lecture series has been a vital platform for exploring critical societal issues. We have delved into topics such as decolonizing sociology, the significance of W.E.B. Du Bois' imagination of India, reducing domestic violence and promoting social justice, and the culture of development and development of culture. This year, we continue this tradition by addressing another crucial aspect of our society. We deem it a privilege to have with us an eminent scholar, Dr. Manisha Desai, who will be presenting on the topic, Decolonizing Transactional Feminist Analytics. Dr. Desai is the Executive Director of the Center for Changing Systems of Power and the Empowerment Trust, and Endowed Professor of Global Citizenship at Stony Brook University. For research and action for a new eco-social contract. She serves on the steering committee of the Federation of Feminist Journal Editors, which aims to establish a feminist knowledge commons outside commercial publishing to ensure the free circulation of feminist knowledge across borders and language barriers. Dr. Desai was awarded the Sociologist for Women in Society's 2015 Distinguished Feminist Award and the 2016 Faculty Mentor Award from the Compact for Faculty Diversity in the United States. She has held numerous leadership roles, including President of Sociologists for Women in Society. Dr. Desai's work promises to offer profound insights and foster a deeper understanding of the topic. On behalf of the JJK Student Collective and ISRA, I cordially welcome Dr. Desai to this lecture series. Dr. Ravinder Kaur, Professor of Sociology and Social Anthropology, Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Delhi, and Dr. Anisha Jaydev, Associate Professor and Gender Nodal Officer at the Institute of Management in Government Kerala, are the most fitting individuals to share their memories of Professor Jacob John Kattakayam. Their deep professional connections and personal experiences with him provide unique insights into his remarkable contributions. Their reflections will truly honor and celebrate his enduring legacy. Welcome, Dr. Ravinder Kaur and Dr. Anisha Jaydev. I would also like to extend a warm welcome to Advocate Gracie Kattakayam, his beloved wife, and his children Jibi and Jisha. They are an integral part of our family and a constant reminder that Professor Kattakayam's spirit continues to inspire us. Welcome to you all. The JJK Students Collective consists of 41 research scholars who completed their PhD under the supervision and mentoring of Professor Kattakayam, who today are well placed in different universities, colleges, and research institutes across the country. The Institute of Social Research and Action is a voluntary organization founded by Professor Kattakayam along with some of his scholars and close associates. The primary objective of this organization is to engage in study, research, training, and advocacy on social issues and generate socially significant knowledge. I welcome all the faculty members, research scholars, students, and esteemed guests gathered on this online platform to the Professor Jacob John Kattakayam Memorial Lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandhya. It is my great pleasure to invite Professor Surinder Jodhka to chair this session. Professor Jodhka is a distinguished professor, renowned for his extensive research in rural sociology, caste studies, and social stratification. We are honored to have him lead today's discussion. Professor Jodhka, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Am I audible clearly?
Yes, sir. Please.
Yes. Thank you so much. I really feel honored to be here and to have been asked to be chairing this very important lecture. As was mentioned by Sandhya, Kattakayam was obviously a friend and a colleague, and really enjoyed his company, his humility, his ability to lead an organization like Indian Sociological Society, which has very diverse opinions, very diverse kind of membership. And that's reflected. I mean, the kind of goodwill he left behind. In today's lecture, we already have 143 participants. I rarely do we find, so many people joining a kind of lecture online these days. I mean, during COVID, obviously, we had no option. I have not seen such a big crowd online in a lecture in recent past. So I think congratulations to the collective, which has kind of not only kept the memory of Professor Kattakayam alive, but also in some sense made all of us part of that collective, that community, which in some sense is right now here. But the larger kind of sociological collective, which gives us a sense of meaning that we are doing something which is relevant. And Professor Kattakayam always thought that sociology was not simply an academic discipline. I remember last time I met him, it was I think in 2018 when he had invited me to give a keynote address to the annual meeting of Kerala Sociological Society, which was held at this place called Kaladi, Sri Shankaracharya University, and we also stayed together in the same guest house nearby. And I still remember the kind of concern he had that the discipline obviously should have an organizational structure and organizational capacity, but also should recognize the larger kind of public concern that we need to have. I was also kind of invited to be the writer of foreword to his Festschrift volume. I felt really very honored, and this is something that I really cherish. And I'm very happy that the students of Professor Kattakayam also connect with me in a manner that really makes me feel really honored. So I think having 41 research scholars people who have completed their PhD and who more or less continue to be in profession. Most of them, some of them obviously would not be doing sociology, but that itself is such a great contribution. And Kerala historically has not really been kind of, front space for sociological tradition in India. But I think I'm very happy the kind of contribution Mr. Kattakayam made and institutionalized sociology in southern part of India. And that's something somebody should write about. And I've been attending these lectures, and I think this is another contribution of Professor Kattakayam to connect Indian sociology with the global sociology. If you look at the names, today, Professor Manisha Desai, the first lecture was given by, as has already been mentioned by Sandhya, by Arjunappa Durai, Professor Barve. I've attended these lectures, and these are kind of, this also gives us an understanding of how Professor Kattakayam was also respected globally in the sociology profession. Finally, just a few words. I don't want to speak for very long. And I think today's topic is of immense significance when we talk about decoloniality. I personally, as I understand and the idea of decoloniality, it has two very significant aspects that I think Professor Desai would address, or maybe his focus is slightly different. But when it comes to decoloniality, I really feel very, very excited when I start my course on Indian society, always kind of begin with question of colonial kind of framing of us and of the entire world, not only of Indian society. And how at some level, particularly in context of knowledge traditions, the way we do our social science, we are still in the moment of coloniality. And I think there's still a long way to go for our kind of theories and concepts to evolve. A lot has been done, and all of us are concerned about it, and we are working on it. And I think that's why this lecture is very, very critical. And also we are confronted with a different kind of challenge, which Professor Kattakayam would have been very worried about, that narratives on decolonialities are also being appropriated by the kind of people who, in some sense, are embedded in very colonial narratives of nativity and indigeneity. So decoloniality in itself is not really a kind of celebrated project. We also need to be critically engaging with the idea of decoloniality. And this kind of ranges from what I have written on Gandhi's idea of village to the contemporary right-wing appropriations of what the other is, what the native culture is. I mean, that native culture itself is the kind of appropriation, and the manner in which this is articulated by the right wing is actually borrows significantly from the Orientalist framings of that nativity. And I think that's where questions like feminism, which is a profoundly political and democratic subject, and I think counterposing it with decoloniality makes it really very, very interesting, very fascinating. And I look forward to listening to Professor Desai and being part of the discussion. Unfortunately, this is a memorial lecture. We will not be able to debate with each other, but I think listening to that lecture and contemplating over it would be of immense reward to all of us, and would be a true kind of tribute to Mr. Kattakayam's concerns about building a sociological community which reflects critically on our contemporary times and does it in a kind of global comparative perspective. And I think that's where I think we need to move. And I think I'll stop here now and over to Professor Desai.
Thank you, Professor.
Sorry.
Listening to you has always been a spurt for us, sir. We have now quickly progressed to the heart of the event. It is my distinct honor to invite Professor Manisha Desai to deliver the elevated thoughts and perspectives on the team. May I now invite Professor Manisha Desai for delivering the 4th JJK Memorial Lecture. Please, ma'am.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm both honored and humbled to be following the footsteps of 3 previous lecturers who've all of you have mentioned, from both Michael to Arjun and to Maggie, all of whom are friends and colleagues as well. But most importantly, I'm really sort of honored that so many of you have continued to honor Professor Kattakayam's legacy. And while I did not have an opportunity to meet him personally, I'm aware of his work. And so this is doubly inspiring, particularly to see so many of his students continue his legacy. So thank you so much for inviting me to deliver this talk. And I'm going to share my slides with you. Okay, so it's visible, right? So just to comment on the slides themselves, as Professor Jurka said, decolonizing is an interesting analytic itself, a term, and it's been appropriated across the spectrum. And so we need to be engaging with it critically as well, which is part of what I'll be doing in this talk. But what I wanted to talk about the slides, or the background of the slides, is we always see the world projected from a very northern perspective. As some of us who might be geographers know, the usual Mercator projection of the Earth or the globe shows the northern hemisphere in the north, and there's a very disproportionate way in which Europe forms the center of the globe, and then the rest of the world kind of, is almost squished up. Greenland, for example, is very big. Africa is very small. And so I've been thinking about decolonizing for, a while now. I also think about how we actually present. And so I was fortunate enough to find different projections of the globe and of the map, which I think is a way of kind of shifting the way in which we think about it. So this one is 1927's recreation of Muhammad al-Idris map from actually the 16th century, just to see what we thought of the globe and the world. And the rest of my slides also kind of show different projections, just as a way to keep us kind of thinking about how do we imagine, our realities and the world in which we live. And so that was just kind of a little bit of a comment for you to also focus on the different projections of the globe that I have in my slides, because I find it an interesting way to kind of rate the patterns in which we normally think about the world, the globe, and our societies. Right, so some of you may be familiar with what transnational feminist analytic is, and very often, let's see how to, my slides. Okay. So just a very quick outline. First, I will define what the transnational feminist analytic is. Very often people are familiar with transnational feminism, and they tend to think about it more descriptively as movements that cross national borders. So for example, since 1975, when the United Nations declared the International Women's Year, there have been 4 world congresses, women's world conferences around the world, where feminists from around different parts of the countries of the world have come together. And so people very often think about transnational feminism as a more descriptive way of social movements across borders. But transnational feminist analytic is a way of thinking about the ways in which feminist scholars have kind of produced a different way of thinking about transnational feminism. So I'll start with defining that first. Then I actually talk about settler colonial and indigenous feminist challenges to it. So again, transnational feminist perspective emerged from a very particular time and place in the US Academy, primarily by post-colonial scholars, actually 2 very important scholars who defined the canon, Indrapal Grewal and Chandra Mohanty, are both scholars from India, but who are located in the United States. So it's a very specific moment in time by scholars, post-colonial scholars, you can say, who are working within a Western academic tradition. And so what were some of the gaps that they had in their own context, given their own traditions? And so then I talk about the settler colonial and indigenous feminist challenges to this transnational feminist analytic. Then I move on to more pre-colonial, because as Professor Jodka was saying, very often we think very much about coloniality and forget about pre-colonial and the ways in which Adivasis, Bahujan, and Dalit feminists today challenge mainstream feminists in India, or the autonomous feminist movement, which has been in some ways the spokesperson for a lot of feminism from India. So I talk about decolonialities also, particularly in the case of India. We very often focus so much on the colonial and post-colonial and forget about the pre-colonial hierarchies that still continue to impact, and the ways in which the colonial context was able to redefine those hierarchies and continue it. And then the post-colonial kind of continues, along those. So I think it's important to sort of in some ways also not necessarily center, but be in conversation with the pre-colonial as well. Finally, then I also talk about the post-socialist challenges to the transnational feminist analytic. Because again, in the sort of transnational world, transnational feminist world, what in a way was reproduced was the earlier narrative of the First World versus the Third World. We're all familiar with, the Cold War sort of geopolitical division of the world into first world, second world, and third world. And post-coloniality specifically only talked about the relationship between the first world and the third world, forgetting completely or erasing what used to be called the second world, which is now erased, but it's the post-socialist second world, which was part of the Soviet Union and its sort of satellite countries. And so I sort of talk about, all of these challenges. And then finally, sort of moving forward questioning. So what do we do with this critical analytic framework? And given where we are today, where we have global challenges, not just of climate change, but we've all been through COVID. So we know that even health challenges become global very quickly, given, the interconnections through which we live. And so how might be some of the ways in which we might think about moving forward? So that's kind of a very quick outline of my talk today. All right, so starting with the transnational feminist analytic, as I mentioned already, that it really emerged in the US Academy in the 1990s, early 1990s. And it was in the context of the transnational women's movement that were facilitated, as I said, by the United Nations 4 World Congresses. One was the 1975, which was the International Women's Year. And clearly at the end of that year, when all the countries wrote the report, and in India, we're familiar with Towards Equality, the report that was written by Veena Majumdar and others, documenting the unequal status of women in India. And similarly, throughout the world, it was very clear that women everywhere were in some ways, no country had equality between men and women. Again, at the time, we were thinking in terms of gender binaries. We did not really think in terms of gender as a non-binary or gender queering, were concepts that were not yet part of even the transnational feminist analytic. And so after 1975, the United Nations declared 1975 to 1985 as the International Women's Decade. As part of the decade, there were 3 World Congresses in 1980 in Copenhagen, 1985 in Nairobi, and then 10 years later in 1995 in Beijing. And some of you may be familiar with this kind of, United Nations organized international women's conferences around the world. But what became very clear throughout these conferences was that gender itself was a very contested term. The gender inequality did not appear in the same ways in a lot of different countries, that along with gender, and this is where we kind of have, the intersectionality, analytic that emerges at the time, is that at the time, first world versus third world women, there were issues of coloniality, there were issues of caste, there were issues of race, in addition to class and gender, which informed the ways in which women could actually experience their lives, but also the ways in which women's movement in those countries struggle. And so during the 1990s, there was a lot of foment that gender was not monolithic, patriarchy was not monolithic, that patriarchies in different parts of the world interacted with their specific colonial, pre-colonial, and post-colonial histories. And so there was a need to think about not international, but transnational. So transnational feminist analytic then, in a way, was contrast to international and global feminisms, which had emerged as ways of thinking about the women's movement in the 1970s as a result of these conferences that I mentioned. So international kind of borrowed the international relations analytic of nation state, of centering the nation state. Global feminism kind of moves a little bit away from international feminism to talk about patriarchy as being the common experience of women worldwide, given that each country had written reports in this decade that I mentioned, and that no country had, gender equality, that women everywhere were unequal, led to a sense that we needed a global feminism because women everywhere in some ways were unequal to men. And so in the 70s and 80s, you had international feminism and global feminism as analytics to talk about the ways in which women everywhere experience patriarchy, no matter the differences in patriarchies, no matter the differences in history, context. And so then the transnational feminist analytic was a way to contrast the international and global feminisms that were essentially the discursive ways in which feminisms were talking about each other in the 70s and 80s. So what did the transnational feminist analytic bring? The transnational feminist analytic, as I've written before, actually kind of brings in a radical geography. the spaces, kind of rethink geographies, not, spatially also, but also metaphorically. But it also was a critique of modernity, the ways in which we thought that modernity was the answer towards progress and equality. But in fact, we see that that hasn't been the case, particularly in women's rights movements. So then the transnational feminist analytic, informed by the post-colonial critique of modernity, also then begins to critique nationalism, as well as feminism's imbrications with nationalism. So almost everywhere, feminism and nationalism have had an interesting and a tense relationship. During our own independence struggle, we know that feminists and nationalists work together. And so you do actually have, a way in which a certain progressive vision of women's rights becomes part of the nationalist agenda. But in other cases, as we see now, in fact, I just read a fantastic article just yesterday, which I was reviewing, which is coming out in Science, about instant justice in the case of Disha's murder in Hyderabad, and the ways in which vigilante justice led to the encounter killings of the 4 perpetrators. So in the ways in which now women's sexuality and women's rights do get kind of taken over by, nationalist forces, leading to actually, in some ways, leading to the end, kind of, taking over state rights and a kind of lawlessness where you have, killings without impunity. And so you can see that, feminism and feminist issues can be appropriated by the nationalist movements, essentially to get away with impunity and, in a way, kind of reintroduce patriarchy or different kinds of patriarchies. So the transnational feminist analytic then reintroduces the critique of nationalism, introduces the critique of modernity, as well as kind of reshifts the geography, decentering the nation state and decentering kind of the first world, third world geographies of post-war context, to kind of rethink the multiple scales and the multiple ways in which feminism, nationalism, and modernity all kind of circulate. And so that's kind of, the definition that I have of the transnational feminist analytic and the ways in which it brings together what was happening, particularly in the 1990s. Now, as we're all familiar, the 1990s are also the decades of kind of a resurgent kind of globalization. We know that globalization is not a new phenomenon, and anthropologists in particular talk about 3 phases of globalization: ancient globalization, medieval globalization, and then modern or more contemporary globalization. So globalization itself is not new, but contemporary globalization as we know it really kind of takes off in the in the 1990s in the form of neoliberal globalization, with financial capital becoming much more important. And it's in this context that you have the emergence of transnational feminist analytic as a way to think about the ways in which the old binaries of first world, third world really get kind of reformulated now to, of course, what we all talk about, the global north and the global south. And so there's kind of a shifting of geography. So there's a different geographic element that's part of the transnational feminist analytic. There's also a shifting of scale from the nation state and the regional to the global of the global feminist, analytic from the 1970s and 80s, to thinking about multiple scales, right? And particularly Grewal and Inderpal, Grewal and Kaplan, who talked about, were among the first to write about transnational feminism, actually talked about a scattered hegemony, that what we see with globalization is no longer sort of, 2 metropole versus colony of, the earlier colonial context, but we have different scattered hegemonies. So then the scale shifts away from the nation state to kind of the dispersed way in which now power circulates in the context of contemporary globalization. And so you have this sort of reshifting of scale, decentering the nation state, kind of corporate capitalism becomes much more important than the nation state itself. In some ways, one can almost say that the nation state becomes kind of a facilitator or a midwife, for the expansion of corporate capitalism. So the transnational feminist analytic then, given that it emerges within the context of neoliberal globalization, kind of decenters the nation state to bring in different scales and to critique both modernity and nationalism and feminism's imbrications with it. So the focus then for the transnational feminist analytic is that feminisms are local, diverse, and the feminist praxis challenges these scattered hegemonies in the context of transnational and neoliberal global capital. Now, the transnational feminist analytic, as I said, emerges specifically within the US Academy in the 1990s, but no sooner does it emerge than the critiques emerge of transnational feminist analytic. And among the first critiques to emerge of it is from indigenous feminists in the United States. Right? And that's where sort of the decoloniality comes in, because for these feminists, they never had a post-colonial movement. So kind of, to think about even post-coloniality is a luxury since they still are within a settler colonial state. And so they kind of critique the transnational feminist analytic for its lack of attention to what, in some ways, Guthrie Spivak and others have called the epistemic violence they had talked about the epistemic violence of coloniality, but for the indigenous feminists in the United States in particular, it was the epistemic violence of settler coloniality. That is, how do we kind of, in some ways, almost erase both the knowledges and the ways in which the knowledges of indigenous communities, particularly indigenous feminists, were erased and continue to be erased, even in the context of now neoliberal globalization. So then one of the critiques of the settler coloniality or the indigenous feminists was about the epistemic violence of settler coloniality. The second critique that they had of transnational feminist analytic, and I already kind of alluded to that, was the coloniality of gender binaries. Right? And we know that even, in the context of India, we've had multiple genders beyond male, female to hijras and others. But particularly in the indigenous communities of North America, and also to some extent South America, gender has never been seen as a binary. There were always people who were called two-spirited people who were, on a gender continuum. Gender was never a binary. And yet transnational feminism kind of continued to reproduce the gender binary. And we sort of see that in almost all the development discourses, particularly around gender and development, even though we use the term gender, which was as a way to move away from thinking about women, because we had women in development in the 70s, and then again in the 90s, we moved to gender and development. But gender then just becomes, in a way, another proxy for women, because we're really not talking about, gender was supposed to talk about the relationality between men and women, but men don't necessarily appear when we're talking about gender and development. The focus continues to be women. And so for the indigenous feminisms, particularly in North America, transnational feminism not only kind of ignored the epistemic violence of settler coloniality by focusing on the post-colonial, but it also kind of reproduced the gender binaries that very often reflected, in the case of indigenous communities, an imposition of colonial gender binaries. And of course, what is interesting is now, in the last 10, 20 years, we all know that people, even in India, we've, had recognition of third genders. We understand the concept of queering genders. We understand the concept of gender and sexuality, the relationship between those. And a lot of that was missing from the transnational feminist analytic. And that kind of critique came not necessarily from the LGBTQI communities, but really from the indigenous feminisms, because of their own focus that did not include these gender binaries. So that was kind of, the first critiques that began to emerge of the transnational feminist analytic in the late 1990s in the United States. Then what you also see happening with the transnational feminist analytic is kind of its erasure or lack of focus on the pre-colonial hierarchies. And that specifically emerges along with the ways in which indigenous feminists were critiquing transnational feminists from within India itself. And as I said, it's sort of, not unrelated that, the two most prominent scholars who defined transnational feminism were Indian scholars, namely Inderpal Grewal and Chandra Mohanty. And again, even though they did refer to inequalities beyond gender, very specifically, we've had in the last 20 years, sort of critique of Indian feminism itself by Adivasi, Dalit, and Bahujan feminists, who highlighted the importance not just of coloniality, but also pre-colonial hierarchies and gender injustices that emerge from that. But the importance of these pre-colonial hierarchies is that they continue even in post-colonial India. And then none of you, in this conversation need to be reminded of the ways in which, particularly in the last, 20 years, and particularly since Modi's, regime since 2014, we've seen the ways in which Hindu nationalism kind of appropriates a particular understanding of Hinduism and Hindu caste hierarchies, and the ways in which they kind of become appropriated for continuing gender injustices against Dalit, Adivasi, and Bahujan women. And so that was another sort of critique of transnational feminism, that while at a global level, it reframed the global geographies and critiqued it and talked about different scales, that in some ways it, even though its focus was on local and diverse and scattered hegemonies, it did not include these pre-colonial inequalities, particularly in the context of India relating to caste and Adivasi status. And so they talked about the matrix of pre-colonial, colonial, post-colonial, and how that is implicated. And so we begin to kind of see a reframing of transnational feminism in the context of kind of positioning pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial to actually begin to think about decolonial. Now, feminists in India still don't necessarily use the decolonial as much, because we are very much in some ways still in conversation with the post-colonial. But I would argue that the kind of critique of Adivasi, Dalit, and Bahujan feminists, in a way, and if they don't use the term decolonial, is about kind of moving beyond coloniality to looking at pre-colonial hierarchies and addressing those, which I think is a decolonial, moment and a decolonial praxis as well. I want to sort of move on to the post-socialist critiques of feminisms, and particularly of transnational feminist analytic. As I said, given the focus of the early transnational feminists on the kind of North-South binary, particularly kind of reproducing the first world, third world binary of the Cold War context, even though it shifts, and now it's not first, second, third world, it, makes the global North and the global South. And a lot of post-socialist feminists say, and then what happened to the second world? Why is the second world erased? And so that's kind of where you sort of see post-socialist feminists also engaging with transnational feminism. But what's interesting is that all of these critiques in a way suggest two things, I think. One is the hegemony of discourses that emerge from the United States, even within feminism, and the ways in which they circulate all around, but also the ways in which different feminists from worlds that weren't necessarily engaging with these hegemonic discourses are now engaging with them to challenge and critique neoliberal globalization, but they also have a very interesting history, which is of their own colonial histories with the Soviet Union, and those very often get erased. And so the post-socialists then talk about, excuse me, the absence of the erasure of the erstwhile second world in the feminist experiences from this meta geography of the global North and the global South. So they kind of reinsert the absence of the second world, and particularly of the now the post-socialist world, and particularly the importance, as we see within the context of the wars in which we currently find ourselves, the material ones. Very often, the Second World was thought about as an incomplete European world, or what Manilova, a Russian feminist, talks about nested Orientalism. Professor Jodka mentioned the ways in which, the Oriental understanding of India kind of gets reappropriated by the Hindu nationalists. And so the kind of post-socialist feminists talk about the ways in which there's also nested Orientalism of the Second World, particularly of the erstwhile Soviet bloc, as kind of seen as an incomplete Europeans, that they were somehow second-class Europeans. And so you have even a colonial history within Europe itself, the nested Orientalisms. But particularly what the post-socialist feminists also bring to the conversation is the history of collaboration with anti-colonialist struggles in the South. So if you're going to reframe transnational feminist analytic, what the erasure of the Second World does is not only kind of their own histories and struggles, but the linkages of the struggles and the collaborations and solidarities of erstwhile Second World with the anti-colonial struggles in the South. And so they kind of remind us of the histories, the various histories that really need to inform us as we think about solidarities going forward. And so I want to sort of conclude by, if we have all of these critiques, how do we move forward? And here I sort of like to think about the work of Raven O'Connell, who's talked about what she calls the solidarities of epistemologies. What she means by the solidarities of epistemologies is, if we think about social theory and the history of social theory, particularly in sociology, we've kind of moved from, the pyramidal understanding of theory, where the North produces theory and the South is a source of data. So we have this kind of pyramid. The core is the source of theory and the periphery is the source of data. She says that's one way of thinking about social theory. But another way of thinking about social theory, which, was obviously critiqued, and we moved on to what she calls a mosaic understanding of social theory, which is that we recognize that social theory emerges not just in the North, but in other places as well. But all of these different social theories, like a mosaic, are sort of, next to each other, but they're not in conversation with each other. So we kind of recognize the diversities of social theories. We recognize, that yes, the West is not, the only place where theory is produced, but in the mosaic understanding, we recognize, but there's no engagement. And so what Raven O'Connell suggests is what she calls solidarities of epistemologies, which is that all of these different theories that originate in different places are not only in conversation with each other, but they actually are critical of each other, because there's no theory that in and of itself, is not liable for critique, and that kind of critique should, so in a way, she's kind of critiquing what we've seen, over the past 20 years in terms of either Afrocentric theory or India-centric theory, sort of critiquing the hegemony of the North by creating alternative kinds of hegemonies. And for her, none of those hegemonies actually reflect the ways in which we need to address realities today, which is critiquing all of those. So for her, then, the solidarities of epistemologies is recognizing the different theoretical traditions that emerge, but also recognizing the need for these theoretical traditions to engage each other critically, but also respectfully, so that we don't reproduce the colonial power relations in terms of what counts as theory and what counts as data. So that's kind of one way, I think, in which we can move forward in terms of transnational feminism as an analytic that can be responsive to the critiques that it has received over the decades since its formulation in the 1990s. The other is the spatiality, and that is something I think that transnational feminist analytic really encourages us to think, that it needs to be multiscalar, that if you're going to have feminist struggles, they need to be both translocal. And, you mentioned Appadurai was one of the speakers earlier in this series, and he sort of, talked about translocal who've developed a 1-acre model of climate resilient agriculture. And these women in Maharashtra then also talking with women in Africa. They're talking with women, in other parts of Asia to think about how they can share with us. So then what we have is translocal, of course, transnational and regional as well. So the spatial radical geography becomes much more multiscalar. Epistemically, we think about solidarities of epistemologies, where you engage and critically reframe the ways in which feminists from different places work together. And finally, in terms of praxis, we think about solidarities across differences. So this is a concept coined by Jodi Dean, who's a political theorist. And initially, as I said, with international feminism, the notion of solidarity is, was global sisterhood, in which we kind of erase the differences among women, that while patriarchies informed and influenced most women's lives, the ways in which they landed also shaped by the historical context, the contemporary context, their class, their religion, in the case of India, their caste, and recognizing those differences, and yet finding the common ground is the ways in which we can move forward. And so in terms of practice, we need to be working with solidarities across differences. That's challenging, as we know, with the ways in which social movements emerge. In the end, my sort of specific focus has always been social movements and the ways in which collectives are able to bring about social change. And so I think in terms of moving forward, these are the three ways, epistemically, spatially, and in terms of praxis, how the transnational feminist analytic can enable us incorporating these critiques to address some of the challenges that we experience today in the contemporary global context of neoliberal globalization and hyper capitalism. Thank you.
Professor Jyotka, please.
Yeah, I didn't realize I had to comment on her lecture as well. That was not scheduled in the program, but wonderful. Thank you very much. I particularly like the fact that you have, in some sense, woven your lecture in a kind of spatial imagination. And I think that's where perhaps we need to go. The only point that was coming to my mind towards the end of your lecture is that how does one really operationalize the idea of diversities of social theory? And the moment we think of theory or social theory, it again kind of takes us to kind of academic field. And that academic field is in some sense very significantly stamped with coloniality, the fact that we can speak only in one language, and that is the language of white man, Englishman, and Americans. So I think the hegemony of English in some sense has increased globally. We even don't see the Germans and French trying to kind of, come forward with their theories from their native languages. They also try to translate themselves in English language. So I think these are some of the issues. I'm not raising them as questions, but I think this is the way to go, that the kind of, also I think some of these voices need to come from the global south and what we call as, so again, if the agenda is set in the global north, it somehow remains embedded in the same kind of cultural narratives, which take many things for granted. I mean, by very kind of, quick response to it. But again, thank you very much for such a wonderful kind of talk and opening up so many questions. Again, since we don't have discussion, but I think the other discussants would perhaps have some things to say, I would stop here. Thank you very much.
Can I quickly comment? Is that okay?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Sure. So I was going to say that in some ways, actually, feminists both in India and elsewhere have already begun to think about, you're right, that unfortunately English has become hegemonic, and it's not just the Germans and the French, but also the Chinese and the Russians are also translating in English. So unfortunately, that's true. But I think feminists in India, I remember from the 70s and 80s, have always brought in activist voices using the language that they use. And I think all of us who are teachers, and I do that in my classes. And, in the last book that I wrote, I actually had Gujarati quotes in Gujarati in the text, transliterated and then translated into English. And I think a lot of us are doing that, of bringing in activist voices. And that's, I think, Connell's point of solidarities of epistemologies, to recognize that knowledge production doesn't happen in the academy. It happens outside. And so how do we bring in activist voices? I, for example, in my center now have a program called Artivist in Residence, where I'm bringing artists who work on social justice in conversation in the classroom, and their language is dance, their language is music. That's not English. And so I think when we actually take this very seriously, then how we teach and how we write is also, I think, very important. And I've shifted how I write, and actually, you know, using podcasts and not necessarily writing books. But of course, I'm in a privileged position that I don't have to get tenure and promoted anymore, so I can do what I want to do. But I think at the same time, and I think that was Professor Kattakayam's administrative role, and I've served in many administrative capacities, I've also worked to change the criteria for tenure and promotion so that different kinds of knowledge production and different kinds of public sociologies are also included as part of, you know, legitimate knowledge that should be recognized for tenure and promotion. So I think practically there are ways in which we can do it, and a lot of us are trying different things, but you're right, we are working always constrained by the dominant mode of knowledge production and knowledge promotion. But I think we've found a lot of us all around the world have come up with creative ways to bring in these alternative voices and question this hegemony. But you're right that we do work in that context.
I'm tempted to add something more. I mean, the very idea of theory, and in some sense, in the Indian context and in the Indian university context,
Yeah.
I particularly don't teach theory courses, and I do it purposely. And I think it, in some sense, also then brings in a different kind of elitism. And people who do theory, they have a particular kind of language, and they think the empiric becomes redundant, or, you know, the way activist would be seen as a voice, while theorist is seen as a kind of, you know, global imagination. And that hierarchy also, in some sense, produces in the Indian context a kind of Brahminism, that, you know, I know the world and you know your specifics, the point that you began with, that how at some level, you know, theory itself is a kind of, you know, hierarchical structure, and it itself is embedded in the same epistemic inequalities, or whatever one wants to all that. And I think we are kind of on the same page. But I think even the word theory needs to be perhaps deconstructed, and we need
Absolutely.
to bring in different language through which we can recognize those voices also being theories. I mean, the theory doesn't have to be approved by a refereed journal, right?
Absolutely, which is why when I teach sociological theory here, I talk about Savitribai Phule. And
Precisely,
so
yeah,
students
absolutely.
here are looking about Savitribai Phule. She's a theorist as far as I'm concerned. She had amazing things to say. So I think I absolutely agree that theory is not in a particular domain, and I don't bring in Savitribai Phule as an activist, but as a theorist.
Thank you, Professor Jyotika, for the concluding remarks. As it is a memorial lecture, we have limitations in including an interactive session here, but we appreciate the extremely engaged audience here. Thank you, Professor Manisha Desai, for your enlightening and thought-provoking deliberation. Your insights on the topic have provided us with a deeper understanding on decolonizing transnational feminism, and have truly instilled a clear perspective to look at transnational feminism. We are grateful for your time and sharing of your knowledge with us today. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure.
As the evening has progressed, we can transit from an academic rigor of the session to a more personal introspection. The second half of this event is sharing of memoir about Professor Kattakayam by one of his close friends, followed by one of his students. Dr. Ravindra Kaur is the community. May I now invite Professor Ravindra Kaur for sharing the reminiscence of Professor Kattakayam.
Thank you, Sindhu. I'll restrain myself from joining the discussion that took place earlier. But just to mention that, India produced subaltern studies. And apart from that, there are many unknown and unsung intellectuals in India like A.K. Saran, J.P.S. Oberoi, who have at various moments, tried to fight the very forces that Surinder is talking about. And anyway, but that's for another time. As Shinju said, my job here or my role here is to talk about Professor Kattakayam, who I was closely associated with for a couple of decades. So I'd like to begin by thanking the organizing committee of the memorial lecture for inviting me to share memories of my association with him, which is also our mutual association with sociology as a discipline in India. It's my honor to do so for a person who I can say was a selfless institution builder and who devoted his life to building the discipline of sociology across the country. I think anyone who knew Professor Kattakayam or came into contact with him would remember him with great warmth. He had a large following among students and peers in the sociological fraternity, as is evident from this memorial lecture, which is in its 4th year. He had a great generosity of spirit and always reached out to colleagues with an unusual humbleness. It was, I think, due to this approach that he was able to persuade many peers in sociology to serve the discipline through the Indian Sociological Society. He was an extremely active member of the society even before he came into leadership positions. He served the society selflessly, treating it like his own child, nurturing it and taking it to greater heights. It goes without saying that he had an equally intense association with the Kerala Sociological Society and its journal, The Kerala Sociologist. I recall, like Surinder, delivering a keynote at the Kerala Sociological Society annual meeting and the publication of my lecture in the journal. I first came into contact with Professor Kattakayam through Professors A.M. Shah and Professor Bhaviskar, who were my teachers at the Department of Sociology, Delhi School of Economics. I got to know him really well during our mutual association with the Indian Sociological Society. He had been active with the society through Professor Oman, Professor P.K.B. Nair, Professor Shah, Professor Bhaviskar, Professor Dhanagre, Professor Partha Mukherjee, and many others when I met him. Over the years of my association with him, I understood his utterly selfless devotion to the society. He was not in it for position or power for himself, but for the betterment of the society. He worked tirelessly, and his genial approach and quiet persistence persuaded many sociologists like me to contribute more to the society. In 2003, he became a secretary of the ISS under Professor Dhanagre's and Professor Mukherjee's presidencies. And in 2010, he became the president of the ISS, capping years of efforts. Professor Kattakayam was an institution builder. He strengthened the Indian Sociological Society tremendously, and together with other senior professors, made the ISS journal, the Sociological Bulletin, into a well-respected journal. It was under his presidency that the Golden Jubilee volumes put together from articles that appeared in the Sociological Bulletin were released by the then Vice President of India, Hamid Ansari. During our long association, my clearest recall is how much time and enthusiasm he would devote to the society and its various activities. He initiated new activities such as a newsletter, the Young Sociologist Workshop, and much else. He was instrumental in persuading me to hold one such workshop at IIT Delhi in 2011 on the theme of doing research, doing ethnography. Professor Kattakayam believed in motivating and supporting young scholars through the awards for best papers. The workshop continues until today, and IIIT, one of our sister institutions, is about to have young sociologist workshop very soon. I was a member of the managing committee of the ISS from 2003 to 2009. Professor Kattakayam was instrumental in persuading me to take on the role of the treasurer of the society in 2008, despite my reluctance. After I completed my tenure, he tried his best to persuade me to stand for the post of secretary and later the post of the president. He would ring up, beginning the call with laughter and inquiries after one's well-being, and then slowly slip into the real reason for calling. I wish I hadn't disappointed him by turning down these requests, but I didn't feel I was up to the taking up the enormous responsibility that these positions entail. Never the one to give up. He drew me into his supervision committee of one of his students, Dr. Lakshmi Nair, present here, thereby linking me with the Indian Institute of Space Science and Technology, where Lakshmi was a PhD student. Lakshmi then placed me on her own students committee. I'm sure if we were to make a genealogical tree of Professor Kattakayam's supervision and mentorship of students, it would be an extremely rich academic kinship tree with many branches that continue to sprout as we go down the generations. It was during Professor Mukherjee's tenure as president that he and I worked closely with Professor Mukherjee to hold 2 South Asia workshops. The idea behind these workshops was to kind of challenge the dominance of the Western academy, including the Indians and South Asians who were part of that academy, and to bring together sociologists working on, and particularly those who were working in their home countries in South Asia. We felt that Indian sociologists abroad had plenty of networks and opportunities to meet, and South Asian sociologists also went abroad to Western countries, but rarely met each other in their own or neighboring countries. We felt that we shared many of the problems that our countries faced, and that as sociologists, we would gain from sharing them and collaborating to research on them. The first 2 workshops were held in 2005 in Surajkund in Delhi, near Delhi, when Professor Mukherjee was the president of the society and Professor Kattakayam the secretary. Professor Stefan Lindberg, who was a scholar of India, arranged partial funding from SASNet, the Swedish South Asian Studies Network. He took a very active interest in the workshops and wholeheartedly supported the initiative. The first workshop was on the state of sociology, issues of relevance and rigor. The papers emerging from the workshop were brought out in a special issue of the Sociological Bulletin that was very well received. The second workshop was on prospects for collaborative research in South Asia. Subsequent workshops were held in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. There were plans to start a South Asia Sociology Association. We named it SASA, and plenty of efforts were made, including putting together a constitution. But somewhere along the way, we lost steam and were unable to bring this idea to fruition. I hope younger generations will take this much needed initiative forward. Even today, we don't see that kind of interaction, getting together, looking at us in solidarity at the problems that our South Asian societies face. Even though the world is far more globally connected now, and South Asian academics do visit each other, academic get-togethers and collaboration, especially based on in our own countries, remains spotty. Together with Professor Mukherjee, Professor Kattakayam established the Lifetime Achievement Award to be given by the ISS. I recall being with both of them when the very first awards were bestowed on eminent sociologists. I feel, time that Professor Kattakayam is incorporated into this August list in recognition of his yeoman service to building the ISS and strengthening its outreach into far-flung corners of the country. Professor Kattakayam had wide-ranging interests in diverse areas of sociology. Where I connected with his work was his writings on family and marriage among the tribals of Idukki district of Kerala. His interest in aging, along with that of his mentor P.K.B. Nair, was long-standing, working on many fronts on this topic, from research to policy. This too had a gender dimension that attracted me, as is evident from his paper on living arrangements of the old in context of modernization, in which he focused on the elderly women in Kerala. As has already been mentioned, he lectured in many countries and in many universities abroad, and was very well received wherever he went. He had wide networks among the academic community and served on numerous committees. The ICSSR has already been mentioned, including faculty selection committees. Professor Kattakayam had the talent of nurturing and maintaining lifelong relationships. I don't think he had a mean bone in his body. I cannot ever recall him being critical of a colleague, even if he had not been able to get the person's support or the person had behaved badly. His smiling, kind, and genial nature is something that I'm sure his vast network of students and friends will never forget. I was extremely touched that despite his busy schedule, on one of my visits, academic visits to Kerala, he found and insisted on taking me sightseeing. And I still have photographs from them from that time and from our various ISS events and things like that. I was in the United States when he passed away. We were all sad to have lost such a dear colleague so early. I will always treasure fond memories of him, and I'm certain the discipline of sociology will cherish him for the role he played in building sociology throughout the country. The memorial lectures are a befitting tribute to his contributions to the discipline of sociology. Thank you very much. And my greetings and regards to the family. Many of the members I do know.
Thank you, ma'am. Express our deepest sense. We express our deepest sense of gratitude to you, ma'am, for your kind words. Thank you so much. Now, Dr. Anisha Jaydev is an associate professor at the Institute of Management in Government, Thiruvananthapuram, Kerala. She has done PhD in Sociology of Health under the supervision of Professor Kattakayam. She has significantly contributed to gender studies, focusing on the impact of domestic violence legislation in Kerala. Dr. Anisha has served as the Nodal Officer for Gender and coordinated various capacity development programs under the Modernizing Government Program. With immense affection, I would like to invite Dr. Anisha for recollecting the thoughts of our beloved Kattakayam sir.
Thank you, Shinju. Dr. Surendra Jodka, Professor in Sociology, JNU. Dr. Manisha Desai, Executive Director for Changing System of Power and Empowerment, Stony Brook University, New York. Dr. Ravindra Kaur, Professor in Sociology and Social Anthropology, IIT New Delhi. Dear Dr. Santhya R.S., convener of the memorial lecture of our beloved teacher. Dr. M.S. Jayakumar, co-convener. Dear Dr. Tara, dignitaries, colleagues, research scholars, and students of Dr. Jacob work together in state encyclopedic publications, Government of Kerala. So most of you know, I can never be formal when I talk about Dr. John Kattakayam. As a PhD guide, he was more than just a mentor to me. He was a guardian, a friend, and a source of inspiration. And with your permission, let me keep this particular memoir an academic and unofficial or informal. So as I told, I should mark here that the bond between John Uncle and me should have started more than 50 years ago when he was working along with my father. Even though I don't remember, I met him on the very day I was born. Dr. John and a friend of him who was a renowned economist, Dr. Epen, came to the hospital after the visiting time. After the visiting time, he came and he made it possible that he met me and my mother. From that day onwards, I am there in his mind and being as a family member. He was instrumental when my father took decision where I should have my studies, even in my schooling. Again and again, personal note, I should be the only one among his students who drank wine at his wedding reception. I was in 2nd standard when he married Gracie Auntie. I grew up and I had times when I joined his kids in his residence during lunch, when I shuttled from one tuition center to another. And again, when I chose my partner 27, 28 years back, all by myself in a very unconventional way, it was a shock for him, just as it was a shock to my family member. And he was not particularly happy because of various reasons, because I was very young. I was only 20 years of age. And there were a lot of socio-cultural reasons for that. In my father's absence, my father was in a short stint of work abroad. He came along and he was physically present to make sure that I was wedded to a family and I was safe there. Many of his other prodigies in research would vouch that he had flawless affection and concern regarding well-being of them if they are in a position of vulnerability at any point of time. Not only his research scholars of Kerala University of Kerala Sociology Department would vouch that he had utmost affection towards students who have some vulnerability. He directed me after my post-graduation to research, and the only one thing he wanted me was that I should never confine myself excellence. His guidance, wisdom, and unwavering support shaped me into the person who I am today. His impact extended beyond academia. He was a true champion of social justice, particularly the elderly. Later, at a point of time, I was fortunate to be instrumental in drafting the the policy for elderly for Government of Kerala. Now it is under revision. Now, in my life, if I could muster courage in gathering some expertise in gender studies and intersectionality and could partner with different departments in policy formulation, it is because of the guidance given by him. As a friend of my family, he held a special place in our hearts. His warmth, kindness, and generosity inspired his students as well. We cherish his memories of his presence, his laughter, and his love. Sir, your absence is still deeply felt, but your spirit continues to inspire us. We honor empathetic to the research scholars who come and work under us and to guide them as he guided us through the journey. So I bow in front of your memory and I would record here that we all love you with our whole heart. Thank you.
Thank you, Anisha. Although time may constrain us, we know there are countless more memories of Professor Kattakayam that we could share. Anyone who had the privilege of knowing him carries not just memories, but a treasure house of heartfelt moments and experiences. This is what we call a life less ordinary. Professor Kattakayam lives through the fond memories we hold and profound impact of his deeds during his time with us. The depth and range of ideas we could cover today are exhilarating, something each of us gathered here might be grateful for. And to give voice to that sense of gratitude, I invite Dr. Jayakumar MS, Associate Professor, University of Kerala, to propose vote of thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Shinju. Am I audible?
You are audible.
Okay, thank you. So we just had the wonderful Jacob John Kattakayam 4th Memorial Lecture organized jointly by JJK Students Collective and Institute for Social Research and Action. I express our sincere thanks to Professor Sunita S. Joska, Professor Sociology, Center for the Study of Social Systems, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, for presiding over the event. I place on record our deepest gratitude to Dr. Manisha Desai for her kindness. She is the Executive Director of Changing Systems of Power and the Empowerment Trust Endowed Professor of Global Citizenship, Stony Brook University, New York, for delivering the 4th JJK Memorial Lecture. Now I thank Dr. Ravinder Kaur, Professor in Sociology and Social Anthropology, Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, Indian Institute of Technology, New Delhi, for sharing her fond memories of Professor Kattakayam. I also thank Dr. Anisha Jaydev, as for giving a fine introduction to the 4th JJK Memorial Lecture and managing the floor. On behalf of the organizing committee, I express our sincere thanks to the family of Professor a grand success. And most importantly, I express our deepest gratitude to every participant. I do not dare to name everyone. All the
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Sandhya, shall we invite all the scholars here to meet on face? Please join us, all our buddies, please.